Hello and welcome back to Armed Citizens TV. Today we're going to chat with an attorney who was one of our first affiliates with the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. That is John Harris of Tennessee. John's name will be familiar to readers of our online journal because he's one of our most generous commentators when we put out an attorney question of the month. I sure appreciate that, John, and I also thank you for being here to talk with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, in addition to your career in the law, you're the executive director of the Tennessee Firearms Association, and we'll get into depth more on some of the things you're facing on that side of things. But for right now, let's introduce you to our viewers. I understand that you're the latest in 3 generations of Tennessee attorneys. Is that right?
That's correct. My grandfather was licensed in 1940, and I'm the 3rd generation, and my youngest brother is an attorney and also a judicial magistrate.
3 generations, that's pretty good. So what are the practice areas that the Harris Law Office focus on?
We are extremely broad. I've been practicing 38 years, and I'm in a small practice group. So my practice involves representing for almost 3 decades now explosives companies and gun manufacturers and gun dealers in disputes with the ATF. But when I represent businesses like that, I also do quite a good volume of contract review, lease negotiations, construction work. When you represent small businesses, you end up doing wills, estates, probate, even a few divorces. And then you get, business owners have car wrecks and have injuries. So we have a good amount of experience with injury cases, including medical malpractice death cases. So it's a very broad spectrum of practice.
Well, and you mentioned the estates work. A couple of years ago, you gave us a really good interview on trusts for armed citizens. We'll link back to that in the written version, and maybe IT can drop a link up on our video screen here. But that was well worth the time that we spent. I understood a lot more about a field that I knew little about before you educated me on that. And you've really been a friend to gun owners over the years in your own quiet and unassuming way. But one of the things that you've done is you have been the driving force behind Tennessee Firearms Association. Tell us what got that whole story started.
In 1994, Tennessee became a shall issue state, which meant that it created a permitting system whereby individuals who wanted to carry a firearm no longer had to get law enforcement commissions. They could go apply for a handgun permit because we didn't have constitutional carry like some other states did. And in fact, Tennessee still doesn't have that. So we have fundamentally a permitting-based system. And when they adopted the permitting-based system in 94, they really didn't do a very good job of it because there were a tremendous number of statutes that made it crimes to carry in places like public parks, greenways, going into a quick market to pay for the gas that you pumped. We had this entire spectrum of laws that created gun-free zones. And so we took up the banner of realizing that we had to form some type of advocacy group that would fill the void when the national groups left the state after having passed a permitting system to work on the details. And so we formed Tennessee Firearms Association as a 501c4 nonprofit in 1995. In 96, we formed our first political action committee. And then just last month, we formed our first 501c3 to promote more direct educational opportunities and public interest litigation.
Nice. And so that's a number of years. What have been some of your landmark accomplishments with TFA?
We were able to do things with TFA, like, for example, early on, it was taking up to a year for the state to issue permits because of the flawed way in which it had been enacted with a quote, model law brought in by a national group. So we wrote and passed a law on leading issuance, which means regardless of the status of the background check, the state has to respond to and either approve or deny a permit application within 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
We have that down now in Tennessee to a matter of weeks because we continue to press on that issue. We have passed lifetime permits in Tennessee. We have tweaked our system to the point that we now have, I think, 38 states that will honor the Tennessee permit. And Tennessee honors permits from any state regardless of reciprocity. We have been successful in eliminating a number of gun-free zones. In an area that ACODN is interested in, we passed civil immunity 2 years ago, which means if you're involved in a self-defense event, you cannot be sued civilly until the criminal case is concluded. And then we're pushing now for criminal immunity, which means if you're in a sort of a Kyle Rittenhouse kind of circumstance, they can't even initiate the prosecution criminally unless they can first show that they could overcome a self-defense assertion. So we've got a long list of things we're working on, but also a long list of things that we've accomplished in the last 28 years.
That's wonderful, and I was real interested in what had happened in the past, because our topic today is something that is really of great concern, and that is your current fight. I understand that red flag laws are trying to come to Tennessee. What happened?
Well, in March of this year, we had, as some other states have experienced, a mass public shooting in a school here in Nashville. It just so happened that at least one of the victims in that shooting that was killed, actually, happened to have been a close friend of the wife of our governor. And that has led to a very strong push by the governor within literally about 2 weeks of when the shooting occurred, that he made public announcements that he felt like it was not only time but necessary for Tennessee to adopt red flag laws. Now, he's calling them temporary mental health orders of protection, but they're just a red flag law, is all they are. And what he's trying to do is to enact a law and a system where firearms can be seized from individuals who have committed no crime, and leave those individuals then, once the firearms are seized, and let's assume for the moment they do identify a potentially dangerous individual or someone with a severe mental health issue, his proposal leaves that person at large in the community where they would have access to other weapons for either suicide or homicide purposes. And all it does is take the gun on the naive assumption that somehow eliminates the threat. Mm-hmm. And there are very few conservative, or what we would refer to maybe as a red state, that have these types of laws. And but our governor, and I think in response to emotional circumstances, has proposed and is trying to force our General Assembly back into special session in order to pass his idea of a red flag law.
Is that special session a sure thing, or could that be stopped before you ever bring the legislators back?
Yeah. Under the Tennessee Constitution, the governor has the unilateral and absolute right to issue a proclamation to call the General Assembly into a special session, but he has no authority over what they do once they get here, as long as it's within the scope of his proclamation, nor whether or not they adjourn and just say we're not going to do anything and go home. So he may call the special session, and they may decide as a courtesy, since our General Assembly is a Republican supermajority and we have a Republican governor, that they'll take up something and maybe try to pass something, but there's no constitutional requirement that they do anything other than show up and adjourn.
Well, you brought up a word that I was kind of waiting to deal with, and that is Republican and Democrat. And I think that we've traditionally thought that our Republicans were a little bit more pro-liberty and that our Democrats might be a little bit more prone to restrict our basic civil rights to self-defense. Has that all changed? Can we no longer make that presumption along party lines?
Well, I don't think you could ever actually make that assumption along party lines. And the reason is, at least in Tennessee, and we're well aware of this, even though you've got the Republican Party, it's almost like there are two different creatures, at least within that Republican Party. There's a portion of the party and the party base, in Tennessee at least, that is aligned first with constitutional principles, civil rights, and the concepts on which the nation was founded, of personal liberty. Then there's this other class of Republicans, and it's where our governor falls and our prior governor falls, that are what I refer to as establishment Republicans. And they're the big business, Chamber of Commerce Republicans who, like in Tennessee, have recently voted to give Ford Motor Company approximately $1 billion to build an electric vehicle plant. And they've recently given $500 million to the Tennessee Titans to contribute towards building a new stadium. Now, that's not a core conservative issue that you redistribute tax dollars to private industry, but it's what establishment Republicans do because they're more geared towards big government for Chamber of Commerce purposes than they are smaller government, lower taxes.
Well, and you'd identified in some of your writings, I believe, forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, that some of this on the governor's part almost seemed to be we've got to do something type of response. And then you also have to ask yourself, or is it more a politician's ploy to grab the spotlight? And of course, we don't want to call out the Tennessee governor, but in the bigger picture, how do we who love our liberties and will fight for them combat someone who's really just doing some rabble rousing around a tragedy? How do we stop that silliness?
Well, yeah, I think in Tennessee and in other states, you have to stop that by developing these state advocacy groups and strong PACs long in advance of the time when the emergency arises. It's the same reason we have fundamentally a standing army. We don't wait until we're invaded to go draft everybody and get the army in place and trained. So the state groups and the national groups that support them have to have the infrastructure there to be able to fight when the fight is brought to their steps. Just like Lexington and Concord, those guys, the militia members there, they trained and they were prepared, whether it was an Indian attack or the Redcoats, they were prepared to respond to a threat to their community. And what we have here is we've got a governor who's termed out. He can't run for governor again. He's not given any indication, at least at this point, that he wants to try to run for Congress or go do something else. He's independently wealthy, so he basically self-funded his campaign in large respect. And so this appears to be someone who's insulated from political pressure. And if we're going to fight it, we have to fight it by putting political pressure and accountability on the members of the General Assembly, and predominantly on the members of the General Assembly who identify as conservative or who are at risk for being replaced in the Republican primaries in 2024.
Well, that's good, and thank you for schooling me on the political situation. It's time for us to give up our prejudices that lead us down those lines. Something else has happened that has ended up with some political overtones, and I don't know how much that applies to the red flag situation, but I'm wondering if you could briefly highlight how or if the Supreme Court Bruin decision influences red flag gun confiscations. Is there any help for you there?
Absolutely. The Tennessee Firearms Association was an amicus party in conjunction with Gun Owners of America, so we actually filed briefs in the Bruin case. We've been watching it come through the system for a number of years. And the Bruin case by the United States Supreme Court, which was decided in June of 2022, is a game changer in many respects. One of the things that it did is that it told the appellate courts and the lower courts, and now the states as well, that the standards by which we evaluate whether something is constitutional under the Second Amendment have changed forever. They put down a new rule. And what they've said is if the conduct is clearly covered by the scope of the Second Amendment, which is much broader than keeping and bearing. There are cases that say operating a gun range, being a manufacturer, being in the commerce chain, all of that's covered by the Second Amendment, not just keeping and bearing. And the court said if the conduct is covered by the Second, then presumptively government regulation is prohibited. And then the court said, in order for government regulation to be permissible, that constitutional rights are essentially established in terms of their status at the time that they're ratified, which for the Second Amendment and the original 10 amendments would be 1791. And the court in Bruin said, in order for a gun regulation, whether it's an existing one on the books or one that's being proposed, like a red flag law in Tennessee, to pass constitutional scrutiny under the Second Amendment, the burden is on the government to show by clear evidence that the nation's historical tradition, and that phrase is a quote from the Bruin case, as it existed in 1791, had a regulation or a restriction of the exact same or very similar nature to what's being proposed. And so we're seeing the ramifications of Bruin across the nation with a lot of different issues, particularly under the 68 Gun Control Act, being declared unconstitutional. There are two courts, for example, in New York State that have struck down the New York State red flag law as being in violation of the Bruin standard. And we're telling the legislators, guys, you got to understand, Bruin means something now. And if you pass something that violates Bruin, we are planning to immediately challenge it, not only as a Second Amendment violation and a 14th Amendment violation, but also as a federal civil rights violation. And there has already been one case filed and settled in Tennessee where the state agreed that an existing state law violated the Bruin standard, and not only that it was a violation, but it was a federal civil rights violation.
Wow, because that was going to be my question. I was trying to figure out how to put it into words, is how you get applicable case law. I mean, the New York thing could be influential, but it wouldn't necessarily tell your courts how they had to behave. And then you still come up with this issue of having to hold their feet to the fire, because one of the things we saw come out of Bruin was a lot of legislation that was kind of retribution, and it just flew in the face of it. And so now the fight's back on us at our grassroots level. Do we let it happen? Don't we? Who's going to hold their feet to the fire? Well, in Tennessee, it's going to be TFA. And it's going to be interesting to watch you as you go forward. What is the funding mechanism for these kinds of fights? Because you mentioned that you've got some 501c3s, some 501c4s. How are you set up to fund that? Because I would see Tennessee is a funny state geographically in that you've got a lot of states that you share borders with. And I think that people in the neighboring states, as well as those of us just nationwide, are watching what happens there. How do we get involved?
Well, for example, the Tennessee Firearms Association itself, the original entity, is a 501c4, which is an IRS classification that lets it be what's referred to as an issue advocate. Mm-hmm. So the TFA is funded because of some quirks in state law by membership, just like ACLDN. You have members. Mm-hmm. And members not only pay their annual dues or they buy life memberships with TFA, but we also have the opportunity, under the way the state law works, to ask our members to make voluntary supplemental contributions. So, for example, when we decided to file suit back in February of this year against the state under Bruin to declare the existing state statute that makes public parks and greenways gun-free zones, we made a special call to our membership and said, hey, we're getting ready to file this lawsuit. We're going to have expenses that are extraordinary in doing it, and please make plans, if you have the capabilities, to make supplemental donations for litigation purposes. And we're doing the same thing now with our membership with respect to funding the litigation and the effort to defeat the red flag law in a special session. And then you've got the PAC, the Political Action Committee, that we call TFALAC, and it's tfalac.org if somebody wants to look it up. That entity can take public contributions from anybody anywhere in the country. And so we're raising money through it, and it can run, because of the state law requirements, it can run targeted specific advertising, urging people to vote against or to contact their legislators to vote against specific legislation. So the C4 can educate about what's happening in the special session and what the proposals mean. The PAC then is the entity that can make the press and advocate specifically for action to go out and defeat. And so we're getting donations and support through both channels, including starting to receive some support from industry members, manufacturers, to defeat this red flag law proposal. And then we've got the charity that is really just, it's still getting established fully, but its purpose would be very similar in some respects to the C4, although it's got more limits upon what it can say and it can do when it comes to influencing legislation.
Well, it's interesting how you have to adapt the cause to the tool available to you, but they're really in good hands because it's clear to me you've got a pretty clear understanding. And, I think that my closing observation would be the fight never ends. We think of our southern states as being gun friendly, and yet here we've got, in Tennessee, what you described to us as all these laws on the book making a number of gun-free zones, which it's kind of shocking to hear, frankly. And then you've got to go back to, well, what does the state constitution allow us? How were we back in those formative years, and how did we get here? And can we take those same lessons? And I think this is where you and TFA and TFA LAC come in. How can we prevent that downward slide during our lifetime so we don't hand it off to our kids and nieces and nephews worse than we found it? It's an ongoing fight. What can we do to help, John?
Well, I think part of the need is for us to get the information out, not just to Tennesseans, but like you said, we've got a number of border states, and we've got a number of cities in Tennessee, like Clarksville, Memphis, Chattanooga, that are right on the border. And so a lot of the people that come to Tennessee to work, to recreate, whatever, they're not Tennesseans, but they like my in-laws. They lived, within, I think, 6 miles of the border. So their main place to go for, restaurants and the bigger shopping areas, they were crossing from Kentucky into Tennessee regularly. And so it impacts a lot of people. And then Tennessee's a good vacation destination. Maybe not as good as Florida, but it holds its own. And so it impacts a lot of people when we honor permits from every state in the nation for people to come here. They're at risk coming here if we pass red flag laws and somebody doesn't like how they drive and asserts that they're too aggressive and they might have a gun. So I think it's critical that we realize that each state can't be dealt with independently, because if Tennessee, for example, as a red state and what's seen as a conservative state, we do not want it to become the poster child for how to pass red flag and gun control in a conservative jurisdiction. We don't want it to become the template where you then could go to, say, Texas or another southern state and say, look, Tennessee did it. They figured out how to do it, and we're going to replicate this nightmare there. And so it's a battle. And the part of the step is just getting the word out to individuals, because as we go do public speaking over the last 2 months and talk to people about red flag laws, it's amazing how many people are just so consumed by their daily lives that they don't know that red flag laws are a risk, and more importantly, they don't know what the defects are in a red flag law. So, for example, we've received an industry poll. We didn't run it. It was provided to us on this issue of what do people understand about a red flag law. And it showed in that polling that although there was soft support already in Tennessee for, quote, a red flag law, to do, as you said earlier, to do something, once the information was given to the individuals in the poll that the red flag law would only seize firearms, but that it would leave the individual who's the risk, the crazy person, the disturbed person, at loose in the community with no treatment, no identification. They're just completely still at large and capable. The support for the red flag law dropped to a minority percentage, and 84% of the people responding to the poll said it was more important to identify the risk, the person, and to get them out of circulation, out of the community, and get them diagnosed and treated than it was to seize guns. And it's getting out that kind of information that we're pushing out through our free email list. I mean, anybody in the nation can get on our email list that we're publishing on our websites, that we're pushing out through social media, and then, through interviews like this, trying to get it out on a broader basis so that people might see, hey, we need to help Tennessee defeat this because we might be next in our state.
Coming to a state near you. It's a terrifying thing, but and I think we also are inspired when we see people like you who for all these years stood up, and you've still got your enthusiasm. 25 years in, it's inspiring to see that kind of dedication, and we model ourselves after leaders like you. So I thank you for what you're doing. I'm proud to be able to spread the word among our members, and I'd encourage our members to share the links and put it out in their own little networks. That's the way we've got to fight these things. Thank you for what you're doing, John, and thank you for talking to us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I've enjoyed the chance to answer some of your questions.